You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I'm Paul Garner.
And I'm Todd Wood.
We are back for part 2 in our series on the recovery of the world after the flood. Last episode was great. We're telling the story of how we got the world that we currently live in. Because as we learned in our last episode, the aftershocks of that enormous flood catastrophe lasted for much longer than the flood itself. The flood was a year, but the aftershocks probably went on for centuries. In fact, you could say really that we're still living with the aftershocks of the flood, that the flood didn't just stop when Noah left the ark. It took a long time for the world to get back to some kind of semblance of what you might call normality. Mm-hmm. And of course, you know, as we say, that's could say we're still living with those effects today, because every time a volcano erupts, every time, you know, we experience an enormous earthquake, we are in effect still feeling the aftershocks of the flood. Now, last episode, we kind of looked at the geological questions. We looked at post-flood climate. In this episode, we're going to start to get into some of the biological questions. What are the implications for living organisms? Before we get to that, we want to remind our viewers and listeners that this episode was very generously supported by an anonymous donor. And we're very grateful to that donor for helping us. You've probably heard this from us before, but it takes about $650 to produce an episode. That's about £500 if you're working in British money. It's quite a lot of money. We invest a lot of time on these episodes. We do lots of research to prepare each of these episodes for you. There's a lot of post-production. Our producer, Anna, spends a lot of time sort of working what we record into something that is suitable to share online. Yes. There's some editing and post-production to do.
We have bloopers.
We have bloopers. We have crashes and things like that. Yeah. So we are very grateful for all the support that you're able to give us. And if you'd like to know more about how to donate to support the podcast, or if you would like to sponsor a whole episode or even a series of episodes, then do check us out. You'll find our website at www.letstalkcreation.org, and you'll be able to send us some dollars or some pounds that way. Anyway, with that said, on to biology. Todd, you've spent a great part of your scientific career studying created kinds. But we actually haven't talked all that much about created kinds on the podcast. We've covered it a bit. We did have an episode way back with Gene Leitner, Dr. Gene Leitner. We've covered it in other episodes. But it's not a topic we've covered sort of regularly on the podcast. And that seems a bit strange to me, given that this is a big area of research for you. So why is that?
I don't know. We talk a lot about human origins, I think, because I think that's something that people are interested in. But then with created kinds, I just feel like everybody else is doing more interesting things than I am. So let's talk to them.
Right. Okay.
But maybe that's not terribly realistic. Maybe, we should stop and talk a little bit more about created kinds from time to time.
Yeah, I really think we should, because this work on created kinds is very important, I think, for creationists to understand and appreciate. It's really the foundation of the whole of creationist biology. So I guess before we get into what happened to the created kinds after the flood, which is going to be the theme of this episode, we ought to just begin by talking about what created kinds actually are. So why don't we begin there?
Yeah, sure. That's a hard question. So we'll start with a hard one. what are created kinds? So I'm going to try to describe this from two perspectives, and we'll see if we can't converge on something. How about that? So when you think about living things from kind of a broad perspective, and this is something that we've known for thousands of years. This is not a new insight. Everybody's going to be familiar with this. You can see that certain things are more similar to other things than they are to still other things, right? So, for example, your cat and your dog are very similar to one another. Very different, obviously, true, but anatomically, they've got fur, they've got big teeth, they've got, wet noses and ears that stick up, and their pointy ears that stick up, and so forth. So they're more similar to each other, say, than either one of them would be to a frog. Now, frogs have some similarity, right? Because they have, say, a mouth and 2 eyes and 4 legs and a skeleton. But they don't have fur, and they don't have, a lot of the different features that a cat or a dog might have. Then again, you put a frog and a cat and a dog together, and they're going to be more similar to each other than they would be to, say, a housefly, or to an oak tree, or a mushroom, or bacteria, right? And so on it goes. We've known this for a long time. This is nothing new. This is an obvious insight I think everyone can sort of appreciate when they stop to think about it. Now, the other perspective here on the created kind sort of begins at the finest level of detail, right? We could ask ourselves, what exactly is it that we're sort of categorizing, and when we think about these categories? And when do they go from being, say, this is going to be weird, but when do they go from being sort of real to being something more abstract, right? So, for example, I can see that a cat is a real thing, an individual cat, right? And an individual dog, an individual horse, and so forth. These are real things. I can understand that. I can understand, for example, that cats, even though they are different from cat to cat, there's still a continuity there, because when cats have kittens, they grow up to be cats. And they don't look exactly like mom and dad, but, there's some family resemblance there. And there's another unit that's real, right? I can understand the real physical relationship between a mother cat that is pregnant and has kittens, and the kittens grow up. I can understand that relationship. That's a real thing. But then you start comparing cats to other cats altogether, right? So there's your house cat is kind of part of a larger group of really small cats that are basically wildcats. There's an African wildcat. There's a sand cat that lives in the Sahara region. There's a swamp cat that lives in the Mediterranean. There's even a European wildcat, I think. And then there's cats that resemble those cats. There's a class of kind of small cats like ocelots and jaguarundis and even pumas, cougars, that are all sort of very similar to your house cat. And then those cats resemble things like lynx and bobcat and caracal and lions and tigers and so forth. So you start with the real thing, which are the individual creatures. You can see the reality of a family and a line of relationship, right? When cats give birth to cats, they have kittens that grow up to be cats, right? And then we call that sort of stability over generations, we call those species. And all of this thinking was kind of formalized here at the end of the 17th century and kind of the beginning of the 18th century. And species were understood as kind of those creatures that breed true. That is, they always have offspring that are the same species, the same category as their parents. And if you try to cross two different species, it was believed that you would get something that was unsuccessful. It either wouldn't work, or you would get, say, a mule, right? Like when you cross a horse and a donkey, you get a mule, and a mule is sterile. Mule can't have babies. So people believed that sterility of hybrid was something that was divinely created, right? To protect the boundaries of these species that God had created. And so there's this assumption that starts off here in this sort of gets formalized in the late 17th, early 18th century. That is that species are the things that God created, and God instituted these sterile hybrids in order to protect the species from getting all confused and messed up. And that assumption, I think, is still very much with us even today. Scientists kind of gave it up a long time ago, but I think a lot of regular people still believe that species are species. That's just how they've always been. And you can't cross two species, or you get weird things that don't make sense and don't really breed. But scientists, as I mentioned, they kind of left that behind.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a kind of popular conception, isn't there, that is very common, but it's not really something that is held by scientists. So what changed? I mean, why did scientists go then from believing that species were sort of fixed, created, immutable, unchanging, to believing that things were more complicated than that? How did that happen?
Yeah, so you might think it was Origin of Species, but you'd be wrong, actually. It's actually quite a bit before that. And there's a couple of things that were happening, but the principal problem that people came to was hybridization. And hybridization just sort of messed up everybody's concept of species. So, for example, let's shift gears here from cats to dogs. Let's talk about dogs for a little bit. Here in the United States, we have coyotes, and you can tell, looking at a coyote, you look at a coyote long enough, you can see that is definitely a different species than your typical dog. And now with a lot of coyotes making a comeback, people are probably familiar with the wailing that coyotes do. It's creepy and weird. And yeah, it sounds like ghosts or something. So dogs are definitely different species than coyote, but they can hybridize, which shouldn't be that shocking since, we know about horses and donkeys hybridizing, and they make mules, and dogs and coyotes look really similar. So if you're not really paying attention, you could actually mistake a coyote for a dog. But the really surprising thing here, I think, is that these hybrids are fertile. So a dog-coyote hybrid can mate with the members of the parent species, either another coyote or another dog, or they can even mate with another coyote-dog hybrid, and they can produce offspring. And it turns out that they're not the only ones. That actually fertile hybrids are extremely common. Much more common than sort of the sterile, miserable kind of hybrid. And in fact, if you look at plants, for example, some scientists, and I know there's a lot of assumption that goes into this, but some scientists estimate as much as 80% of your basic flowering plant species that you encounter are of hybrid origin. And as I say, there's assumption goes that it could be lower than that. It could be more realistically, maybe 40 to 50%, maybe as low as 35%. But that's still a lot of flowering plants that are of hybrid origin because, they hybridize and they produce offspring. And this was early on. I mean, this was not a late thing. It was basically as soon as people started talking about sterile hybrids protecting the species, people began to realize that's not happening. There are these hybrids that are fertile. And even Linnaeus. Now, you remember Linnaeus is the one who kind of gave us the modern conception of species. He gave us the whole Latin naming scheme that we use even to this day. So he produced this massive catalog of species. He himself began to suggest that the species were not the things that God created, but that they were in some sense derived from the original created creatures. So, for example, instead of say God created the swamp cat and the sand cat and the wild cat and the domestic cat as all separate species, he might have imagined that God just sort of created a small cat, and that small cat basically gave us these different sorts of cats that we now think of as actual cat species. And it's important to understand, that wasn't much of a change, right? He wasn't saying that, all animals come out of the primordial ooze or whatever, that we're related to, frogs and jellyfish and coral and stuff like that. But still, even the little bit of accommodation he made to the reality of this blurred mess of species sort of blurring into one another, even that little bit of accommodation got him criticized by his contemporaries, because they kind of thought of these species as being God's creations, right? And these were being preserved, and they had this sort of doctrinal notion that they were kind of grafting onto science, that the science just wasn't going to hold on to it. It wasn't going to hold up to it. And frankly, there's nothing particularly scriptural about species fixity either. It's not something that the Bible actually teaches. So yeah, the reality in biology is that species are just hard to recognize. And honestly, they kind of blur together in places. So it's hard to know whether a population is really a species or whether it's just a version of a species that you already know.
I mean, let me push back a bit on that. So,
Sure.
So I mean, you look at a zebra and a horse and a donkey, and I can tell the difference. I know the different species.
Yes.
I know the zebra has stripes and the horse doesn't. And,
Yes.
Yes. They look different. I can tell. They don't kind of just blur together. They're not just a kind of gradation. So is what you're saying really right, that species are not as well defined as we think?
Sure. That's a fair point. There are species that do, right? Lions and tigers and jaguars and cheetahs. Those are obviously different species. Yes, there are realistically some groups that have very clear species that are well delineated, and yeah, that's true. But if you sort of stand back and take a bigger view of things, I think you begin to understand kind of the point I'm trying to make here. So, for example, people will ask me how many species there are of wild Asteraceae. That's your sunflower family, right? Orchid, the Orchidaceae. How many species of orchids are there? How many species of even species of the horses and the cats, right? So you can always find the groups that are very easy to recognize as quite distinct. But if you sat down with an expert and you went through the various populations, that expert's going to come up with a list of things that expert thinks are a species. And you give a different expert the same assignment to sit down with the populations and the evidence and sort of sort through it and come up with his list of species. Those lists are going to be very similar, probably 90% identical. But they're never going to come back with exactly the same list. They're never going to have exactly the same categorization. And again, we're not talking about shocking difference here. We're not talking about this guy says there's 5 species, this guy says there's 500. It's usually pretty close, right? So in the horses, 6 to 8 to 10, something in that range is the usual number that people give. But it would definitely be really strange and weird if they came back and said, yes, we agree completely, we did our work independently, and we all agree this is exactly the number of species. Now, in the 20th century, then there was a biologist named Frank Marsh who tried to put all these ideas together. And he agreed with Linnaeus that species aren't constant and that they arose from more generalized ancestors. But he also said, sort of at the higher taxonomy level, these groupings that we talked about, sort of the vertebrate groupings and things like that, you can get to a higher taxonomic level where things are very distinct. It's really obvious that this thing belongs to this category and not that category over there. And he argued that hybridization was the way to sort of sort through these things. And he said that if two species were capable of hybridizing and producing offspring, then they belong to what he understood to be that original created group of creatures. And he named it kind. He named it Baraman, which comes from the Hebrew terms bara and mean, create and kind. And he's naming it after that kind in Genesis 1.
Yeah, so we have that phrase, don't we, in Genesis 1, after its kind or according to its kind. And we also have that phrase used in the flood account. So when God says to Noah, here's how you're to build the ark, and he tells him he's to bring at least 2 of every kind of air-breathing land animal onto the ark. So presumably these things are connected. What we're reading about in Genesis 1, what we're reading about in the flood account is connected. So God created animals, plants according to their kinds. The land animals are taken onto the ark according to their kinds. But somewhere along the line, these kinds become separated, divided into the different species that we see around us today. Is that kind? Have I got that right? Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, basically that's the story. Yeah, and remember, it's dependent on very specific things that we're trying to make sense of, right? So there's very little scriptural revelation that connects the kinds to species that we know. Now, in the Latin Vulgate, remember that was the Bible of the church for about 1,000 years. That translation renders kind as either genus or species, depending on the chapter. But even when that was translated, those words didn't mean what we in biology mean by them today. So the Hebrew term mean that gets translated kind, that's used very rarely in the Bible. And it's not very common outside of the Bible either, in other literature where we could sort of try to figure out what the word means. So it's not always easy to say the Bible teaches this about kinds. The Bible uses these words. The Bible uses the word kind. Definitely to describe animals, not human beings. Definitely uses the word to describe plants. And those kinds were the things that were taken on the ark. But that's pretty much what we can tell. And we're trying to fill in the blanks from the biology side of things to try to figure out where that connects up to biology. So our model then would be that, the kind is not just the species. It's bigger than that in biological terms, but it's not much bigger than that. There's still a distinct created kind that you can sort of recognize in living things.
So based then on what you've said so far, we've got these groups of modern species that can be traced back. They descend from some kind of more generalized ancestors that God created. But we don't imagine that this is all evolution where all of these kinds are related back to, some primordial ancestor that came out of the ooze.
Right. That's not it.
That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that each of these created kinds has its own kind of family tree that's separate from all of the others. So really we should envisage it not, kind of like a forest of trees, where each of these trees in the forest represents a different created kind. They're separate, they're distinct. And I think it's important to emphasize that, because so often when we talk about modern species being descended from a more generalized ancestor, people immediately think you're talking about evolution. But what we're really trying to do is just deal with the reality of what we see in the biological world. That's what we're trying to do. And it's kind of messier than perhaps, it looks to lay people. And as you say, I mean, Linnaeus himself got criticized, didn't he, by his contemporaries because they thought that he was questioning their theological understanding of things. So it's not surprising, really, that, as creationists, sometimes there's that same sort of misunderstanding. So, okay, allowing for some sort of reasonable uncertainty about the boundaries of these things, where does that leave us? We've got these generalized ancestors representing some great number of different created kinds. And these ancestors have descendants that split up to give us the species that we have today. But is there anything that we can say about that history, about the history of these created kinds? Because this episode is meant to be about life after the flood. Right. We haven't really talked about what's going on after the flood yet.
True.
So
yep.
We've kind of been laying the foundation. So help us on this. What can we say about what actually happened to these created kinds?
Right. So I want to be very clear here that I'm trying to be as general and as assumption free as I can be with what I'm going to say here. A lot of people, I don't know about a lot of people, there are certain individuals who get kind of animated and flustered with me for what I think is going on, and I think they're reading way too much into what I'm saying. They want to drag in flood boundaries and mechanisms of speciation and so forth. Let's just shove all that baggage aside for a moment and just think in the purest sense about what creationists think about created kinds. Okay, so first, creationists generally agree that created kinds are more than just the species. And like we've said, there's a couple of reasons for that. One reason is the reality of hybridization that sort of messes up the boundaries of things. Another reason is this phenomenon where you give two different experts the same classification assignment and they're going to come back with things that are slightly different with slightly different numbers of species and so forth. So there's something weird about species. They're not as recognizable as you think they are superficially, and they're not maybe as stable as you think they are superficially. And then we have this observation from this not observation, it's a hypothesis from Frank Marsh that hybridization then can tell us something about what created kinds actually are. And this is something, again, this is a generally, accepted, generally agreed upon idea in creationism, that hybridization can tell us information about what species were part of the same created kind. And again, that's not universal. It's a tendency, but it's a pretty strong tendency. Okay, so then the next step in the argument then is to say, well, how far can we get with hybridization? Where does hybridization take us in our observation of the natural world? Are we talking about big groups of things that are able to hybridize? Or are we talking about a narrow set of things, very small group, like the sand cat and the wild cat and the jungle cat and so forth? Because that's not really hard to imagine that those things hybridize. Wolves, coyotes, dogs, they all look very similar. That's not a big surprise. But what about wolves and jackals? What about wolves and foxes? I mean, how far does this go? So the answer is, from actual experimental science, it goes pretty far. It sometimes can go surprisingly far. So when you look at credible, and I emphasize here, credible, documented reports of hybridization, not just because your grandpa told you that animal was a cross between a cat and a rabbit, but because you actually have, documentation. You find some surprising things can hybridize. So people might be familiar with ligers, which is the cross between a lion and a tiger, generally quite a bit larger than both of them. That's an example of one of these one of these hybrids. My favorite example when I talk about these sorts of things, and this is going to be kind of where we're going to go with this episode, is Rama the Kama. Now, Rama the Kama is a hybrid between a dromedary camel and a species of llama called a guanaco. Now, these are very different animals, right? llamas and guanacos, they are from the Americas, from South America. And dromedaries, obviously, are from the Middle East. There are no dromedaries naturally occurring in the Americas. There are no llamas that naturally occur in the Middle East. They had to be brought together and induced to produce hybrids. Because Rama the Kama exists and existed at one time, I think he's dead by now, it's been a while, that means by the rules that sort of creationists go by, then the camel and the llama, the dromedary camel and the guanaco llama, they both must be part of the same created kind. So they must have split off from the generalized ancestors that were sort of camel, llama-like creatures that presumably might be part of the Ark passengers. So that's how the reasoning would go. That doesn't depend on the fossil record. I haven't said anything about the fossil record of these creatures. I haven't said anything about how the things could diverge and change. All we observe is, well, people think that hybridization tells you about created kinds. Created kinds are bigger than species, which we kind of assume from the messiness of species boundaries. And so if those things are correct, then it follows that God did not create dromedaries or llamas directly, but created a generalized camel llama thing that then over time split up into camels in Asia and llamas in the Americas.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. I don't know whether that's very surprising for our listeners and viewers to kind of think about that, but I suppose it would be true for other created kinds as well. So
yes,
if you think about horses and donkeys, we've already said they can hybridize, they can give birth to mules. So presumably those two species split off from some kind of generalized horse ancestor that God originally made. Same thing for coyotes and dogs and so on. They hybridize. Their members, therefore, are the same created kind. They came from that sort of more generalized dog ancestor, whatever that was, that God created. And I mean, perhaps we can now try and relate this to the flood. So if these ancestors were not directly created by God, okay, if you think that the created kinds in Genesis 1 are essentially the same as the kinds of land animals that Noah took on the ark, we know that on the ark there were only 2 of every kind of unclean animal. So that would mean, by logical inference, that the species of land animals that we see today in the world must have descended from those ancestral ark animals. So species that today we know as coyote, as dog, are actually post-flood species. They arose after the flood. Same with the donkey and the horse. Have I got that right? Is that kind of the framework?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, following the logic of how all this works, then, yeah. So the camel llama thing that I've been talking about is not properly something that would have been necessarily created directly, unless there had been some sort of stable reproduction over time before the flood, leading from the original creation of animals all the way over to the ark animals. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. I don't know that we know. But the camel llama then more properly would be understood as the ark survivors. And I think we're on pretty firm ground here. I think there's a lot, and you talk to Bible scholars about this sort of thing, there's a lot of allusions in the flood account, particularly in Genesis 8, that make reference back to creation week in Genesis 1. So God sends a wind, right, on the water. That's Hebrew ruach, which is the same word as spirit. So God's spirit hovering over the face of the water in the water-covered earth at the very beginning of creation week. So that's one of those references. So there's a lot of these little tidbits, and after its kind is another one of those features. So to me, that really sort of says, yeah, whatever God made, whatever the group of whatever creatures he made at the beginning of creation, that's what's going to be on the ark there later on. So I think we have pretty good reason to make that inference. Where it gets a little tricky then is trying to connect it down to the biology again, right? And I'd say, Frank Marsh's ideas about hybridization, that's a very widely accepted, let's call it a working hypothesis, right? That's our basic framework with which we're approaching biology. And we're just here taking scriptural references and Marsh's ideas, and we're just sort of taking them to what conclusions we can draw from them, without too many other assumptions about, how these species came about, or how fast they came about, or anything else.
Yeah. I mean, let's come on to that. So we've got this picture then of some kind of dog-like pair, horse-like pair, presumably a camel-llama type pair.
Right.
I like that word,
camel-llama.
Yeah. And they come off the ark. They begin to be fruitful. They multiply, and in that process, their descendants become the modern species. They become dogs, coyotes, donkeys, camels, llamas, whatever. Now, what can we then say about the nature of that process that led to those modern species being derived from those generalized ancestors? Can we say anything about when that happened? How fast it happened? Was it a gradual process? Was it quite sudden? Fill in some of the details here.
Yeah. So mechanism, we're going to leave aside mechanism again, assumptions about whether this is plausible or not plausible. We're just going to try to walk through the logic of where we're going with these inferences here. So, because of course, if you're sort of influenced by evolutionary teaching and you think about how Darwin envisioned, the slow and gradual change in species over time and so forth, you might look at this and you think, well, this create a kind business would produce species slowly over time, and it probably is still happening now, right? And maybe it's faster than what Darwin thought it was, but it's still pretty slow, pretty gradual, pretty regular and steady. And maybe even if we watched closely enough, we could watch it happen. Wouldn't that be fun? And that would be your assumption if you're sort of coming at this, as I say, with sort of evolutionary assumptions, with evolutionary expectations, that Darwin's gradualism is the right way to think about things. And I think we have good reason to think that's probably not right. So we're going to take the dromedary camel again as our case study, our poster boy for this argument here. So we said that based on actual hybridization experiments producing Rama the Kama, a camel-llama hybrid, specifically a dromedary guanaco hybrid, that puts llamas and camels in the same created kind, which means that the animal that got off the ark was a camel llama that was neither fully camel nor fully llama, and that there was time then, at some time, they split up and became the sorts of the dromedary and then the llama things that we know of today. And that this happened after the flood. All right, so can we say what that happened? Well, people in the Middle East have been living with and relying on dromedaries for a very long time. In fact, the English word for camel is actually a loan word from the Greek camelos, which is itself a loan word from some earlier Semitic language, we're not sure which one, from the Middle East, that the Hebrew specifically then is Gamal. So if you can read Hebrew in your Hebrew Bible, you're going to read about Gamal. which is camel. And it makes sense that you would do that because for animals like this, you go to a country where you see a weird animal and you say, what is that animal? They're going to tell you the name in their own language. So the idea that we use camel, we who did not grow up in the Middle East, use the word camel for these creatures, makes perfect sense. We're using the language that they would have used to describe the animal to begin with. And then when you look more closely at, say, the archaeological record, you find that we have very, very old records of specifically dromedaries. We have art. So, for example, in the Saudi Arabian desert, we have rock art of dromedaries that's believed to be older than the pyramids in Egypt. And that would tell us then that dromedaries have existed as dromedaries because we have pictures of them for most of biblical history, which is kind of mind-blowing, right? And then you look into the Bible and you find the first mention of camels. That's in Genesis 12, right? The Tower of Babel is in Genesis 11. And then one chapter over, you have domesticated camels. So remember the story there. That's Abraham and Sarah going down to Egypt for the first time when there's a drought and a famine. And Abraham tries to pass off Sarah as his sister. And Pharaoh tries to bring her into his harem. And he pays off Abraham with sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. Now, you might want to argue about what that word for camel means. The word for donkey there is kind of a bit more of a puzzle. But the word for camel is gamal, right? And we've already said it's a borrowed word. We borrowed that from their language because we asked them, our ancestors thousands of years ago asked them, what is that weird animal? And they said, that's gamal. And we said, oh, a gamal. And it became camel. So it's very hard to look at Genesis 12 and say gamal there is referring to some animal that's other than a dromedary. And you put that together with what we know from the art of the region that depicts dromedaries in human use. And you have to come away with this idea that, okay, sometime between the flood, the end of the flood, when Noah got off the ark with the camel llama creatures, and the time that Abraham went to Egypt, which in sort of, is not very much longer after that, dromedaries, the first dromedary was born, and someone looked at it and said, I'm going to ride one of those. And they became domesticated and valuable animal servants for human beings. So, yeah, we can kind of begin to say some things about the timing of animal changes after the ark, after the flood.
Okay, that seems to me like a very, very tight timescale. If we've already got effectively modern species of camels right after Babel, and you've got to produce them from these generalized ancestors that came off the ark. That's pretty tight. It's certainly not the kind of gradual change that Darwin had in mind.
Right.
We can kind of dispense with that. I suppose your choice, and here we can refer to our biblical chronology series, your choice of Masoretic text or Septuagint text is important, right? Because in the Masoretic text, that's the traditional Hebrew text, the time between the flood and the life of Abraham is maybe a few hundred years, whereas in the Septuagint chronology, the numbers are a bit different, and that time, flood to Abraham, would be maybe 1,000 years or close to 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So there's a difference, and that's sort of important as we think about these. But whichever chronology, Masoretic or Septuagint, we have a very short time scale to produce these modern species, and that is not at all like the gradualistic picture of evolution that most people have in their mind, right?
Right, and that is why I really bristle when people call this evolution, or they call it super evolution or mega evolution or young age, young Earth evolution. It's not. It's never been that. It's absurd. It's kind of dumb to call it that. Because it can't possibly be anything like that, right? It's not like we're talking about, this gradual buildup of mutations leads to, isolation in reproductive isolation, and then those populations become species. That can't possibly be what's happening here. The camel llama creature that was on the ark must have been basically designed to produce the species that we see. It cannot possibly be that this is just mutations over time. That's not going to work.
Yeah. Now, of course, this might make some people feel quite uncomfortable. This very tight timescale. So how about I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So
yes.
So what about if we backtrack and we question one of our assumptions?
Great.
What if the ark ancestors of the dromedaries were already dromedaries? So Noah took 7 of every clean kind.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe dromedaries were on the ark.
Okay. Yeah. One problem I see with that is that Leviticus 11, where it lists the kosher foods, specifically identifies camels as unclean.
Okay.
So presumably whatever camel ancestor was on the ark, it must have been present as just 2 and not as 7 or 7 pairs or 7 times 7. However many you think 7 by 7 actually means. That presumably excludes the camel llama ancestor or even the dromedary ancestor, if you think, a more limited variation.
So basically the only way to have domesticated dromedaries on the ark, so they're already in existence at that point, is if dromedaries were their own kind of separate kind.
Yeah.
And guanacos, llamas, were a different created kind, and they were on the ark as well. I suppose the implication of that would be that Marsh's ideas about hybridization have got to be wrong. Because then you've got hybridization between things that belong to different created kinds. It wouldn't mean, in effect, that they have to be part of the same kind because they can hybridize. I suppose the advantage of this is you don't have to try and imagine how you can get dromedary camels arising between the end of the flood and the time of Abraham.
Right.
But you've probably got to rethink some other things.
Yes. So one possibility is to simply question, as you say, the assumptions, right? And one of the assumptions is hybridization tells us something about created kinds. So maybe that's wrong. And if we did that, though, we have to count the cost, right? The cost would be, we have exceptions to the old idea that hybridization tells us about created kinds. And I should mention here, we're not just talking about camels. So, we're focusing here on camels as one example of what's going on. But there's other examples. There are other species that are depicted in very early human artwork that are pretty recognizable as the species that we have today. That indicates that there has been a lot of stability of these things over what we would think of as human history after the flood. And these evidences are quite independent of what Darwin has said about evolution, right? And there might be other ways to conceive of this. I'm not saying that you have to assume that there's rapid speciation. Certainly not claiming that we're infallible. But if we dispense with this created kinds, then we kind of need to reimagine, in some sense, the last 80 years of creation biology. And it could be done, right? We could do it. I'm not saying we're incapable. But I think, as I said, we have to count the cost. We can't just say, well, maybe in this case, it's not like that. There are other created kinds that are showing us similar patterns to the camels. And we can't just go back to species fixity, because that doesn't work with the biology that we already know and we've already reviewed. There's kind of a package deal here, right? And so if we start questioning certain conclusions, then we're kind of really going back to square one and saying, all right, well, we have to sort of reimagine the whole thing. And you can't just start special pleading with certain conclusions that you're not comfortable with. So, yeah, we're kind of backed into this corner, really. And so, is it really a corner? I guess that's the question. People think, oh no, we're saying evolution. That's not what we're saying at all. Yeah, but it's a package deal.
Yeah. So given Marsh's kind of version of created kinds, we're sort of forced to conclude, aren't we, that the ark creatures came off the ark. They were fruitful. They multiplied. They very, very rapidly split into different varieties, different species. And as you say, I mean, that doesn't look like evolution in the Darwinian sense. This has got to be something very different. It's got to be something maybe pre-programmed or, sort of inherent in the design of these organisms. Yeah, we could go on talking about this.
And we will in future episodes.
And we will in future episodes. But for now, we've run out of time. But we're going to pick up this theme of the post-flood period again in our next episode. So remember, this is a series. Yes. We looked at geology and climate last time. This time we looked at what happened to the animals, the organisms after the flood. Next time, we're going to kind of stay thinking about organisms, but we're going to shift gears a bit and we're going to think about how did they disperse across the face of the earth? Why do we find them where we find them? How did that happen? How did they get to the places where we see them today from the landing site of the ark? So that's the subject of the next episode. So we're looking forward to that. Hope you are too. We'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. We'll see you then.
See you soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.